A little girl fell crying, desperately pleading, "I can't breathe, please stop," as tears streamed down her face. Her stepmother stood nearby, laughing coldly at the child's distress, without an ounce of compassion. Nobody expected what happened next, when a millionaire witnessed the scene and shouted words that would change everything forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The scorching July sun beat down on Willow Creek, turning the town square into a shimmering mirage of color and celebration. Founders Day was in full swing, with streamers dancing from lampposts and the high school band's brass instruments gleaming as they marched past the historic limestone fountain. Children clutched cotton candy, their faces sticky with summer joy, while adults fanned themselves beneath the shade of century-old oak trees. Mary Johnson, just 6 years old, stood rigid in her starched yellow dress, her small frame nearly lost among the crowd of onlookers. Her chestnut hair had been pulled back so tightly that her eyes appeared slightly stretched, giving her delicate features an expression of permanent surprise. She tried desperately to maintain the perfect posture her stepmother demanded, but the heat and the constriction around her chest made each breath more difficult than the last. "Stand up straight," Linda Johnson commanded, her manicured fingers gripping a traditional corset, a family heirloom she insisted would build character in her stepdaughter. The woman's cream-colored sundress and wide-brimmed hat projected an image of maternal devotion that the residents of Willow Creek had come to accept without question. Mary felt her lungs constrict as Linda yanked the corset strings tighter. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. The little girl stumbled forward, her patent leather shoes scraping against the cobblestones as she fell to her knees before the fountain. Water sprayed behind her, creating a cruel mockery of celebration as she gasped for air. "I can't breathe, please stop!" Mary's terrified cry pierced through the parade music, causing several heads to turn. Her tiny hands pressed against her chest, fingers splayed as if trying to pry open an invisible cage. Behind her, Linda towered like a shadow, her lips curling into a cold grin that revealed perfect teeth. "Stand up straight, or everyone will see what a little monster you are," she hissed, loud enough for nearby neighbors to hear. The stepmother's words carried just the right amount of theatrical concern, masking the cruelty beneath. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery glanced over, then quickly away. The Millers pretended to be absorbed in their program. No one moved to help. Laughter, cruel and brittle, spilled from Linda's mouth as she shook her head in feigned exasperation. "Children and their imagination," she announced to anyone listening. "Always so dramatic." The sound of her stepmother's laughter tightened the knot in Mary's throat more effectively than any corset could. She remained on her knees, struggling for air, a small island of suffering amid a sea of deliberate blindness. The parade continued around them, its cheerful rhythm a stark counterpoint to the little girl's silent plea for help. Just as the laughter swelled, a new voice sliced through the summer air. "That's enough." Every head turned as Michael Davis, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, emerged from the crowd, his eyes burning with quiet fury. The whispers began immediately. Michael Davis, the art dealer, whose name graced auction houses from New York to Paris, had materialized like an apparition in their midst. His tailored suit seemed almost offensive against the casual summer attire of the townsfolk. He moved with deliberate steps toward Mary, each footfall commanding attention on the cobblestones. "Step away from the child," he said, his voice low but carrying across the now hushed square. The parade music faded to background noise as onlookers formed a loose circle around the unfolding scene. Linda Johnson's laughter died in her throat. Her fingers tightened around the corset, knuckles whitening as recognition dawned across her features. The stepmother's practiced smile faltered, replaced by something closer to fear. "This is a family matter," she managed, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. "My stepdaughter is simply being dramatic." Michael didn't acknowledge her words. Instead, He knelt beside Mary, his expensive trousers touching the dusty ground without hesitation. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone gentler than anyone expected from a man of his stature. He hadn't stepped foot in Willow Creek in over 20 years, but his presence alone stilled the square. The locals exchanged glances, memories stirring of scandals long buried and whispered stories about why he'd left. Some of the older residents nodded in quiet recognition, while others frowned in confusion. Mary blinked up at him, hope flickering in her frightened gaze. Her tiny chest still heaved with labored breaths, but something in the millionaire's presence seemed to calm her. She managed a small nod, unable to speak, but responding to the unexpected kindness. "You have no right to interfere," Linda hissed, stepping forward, but stopping short when Michael rose to his full height. "I have every right," he replied, loud enough for the front row of onlookers to hear. When a child is in distress in public, it becomes everyone's concern. The tension in the air was palpable. Festival-goers who had been laughing moments before now looked uncomfortable, suddenly forced to confront what they had been willing to ignore. The Founders' Day celebration continued around them, but here, in this small pocket of Willow Creek, time seemed suspended between one world and another. Michael Davis's gaze swept across the villagers, commanding silence with the weight of his reputation. The crowd at Willow Creek's Founders' Day parade recognized him instantly. The millionaire art dealer whose name appeared in national magazines and whose absence from their small town had spanned 2 decades. His unexpected return created a ripple of tension that stilled even the most persistent whispers. He knelt beside Mary Johnson, his expensive suit gathering dust on the cobblestones. The silver-haired man's features softened as he addressed the trembling child. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low, but carrying enough authority that those nearby leaned forward to catch his words. "Nobody will hurt you here." The little girl's frightened eyes widened with a flicker of hope, perhaps the first genuine kindness she'd experienced in public view. Her tiny hands, previously pressed against her chest in distress, slowly relaxed as she studied the stranger's face. Linda Johnson's knuckles whitened around the corset she clutched, her cheeks flushing deep crimson with a volatile mixture of humiliation and rage. The stepmother's carefully constructed public image, the devoted parent, the community pillar, cracked visibly as dozens of eyes shifted between her and the wealthy outsider who dared to interfere. "This doesn't concern you," she hissed, attempting to maintain composure, though her voice trembled slightly. "My daughter has breathing problems. I'm simply helping her." Michael rose to his full height, his imposing presence making Linda take an involuntary step backward. "Is that what you call it?" he asked, each word measured and cutting. The crowd's silence transformed into a low murmur as neighbors exchanged glances. Susan Brown, the school principal, pushed forward through the gathering, her concerned gaze fixed on Mary. "Perhaps Mary should sit down somewhere quiet," Susan suggested, her professional demeanor barely masking her alarm at the situation. Linda's practiced smile faltered as she realized her position weakening. The stepmother attempted to reach for Mary's arm, but Michael's unwavering stare pinned her in place, a silent warning that resonated through the square. "I think it would be best if you stepped back," he said, the quiet authority in his voice leaving no room for argument. Linda retreated, her eyes darting nervously around the crowd as whispers began to ripple outward. The carefully maintained facade of Willow Creek's polite society wavered as uncomfortable truths bubbled just beneath the surface. Robert Smith, watching from his carpenter's stall nearby, caught Mary's eye and offered a gentle, reassuring nod. The quiet man recognized something in this unfolding drama that resonated with his own painful past. The summer air, previously festive with parade music, now hung heavy with unspoken accusations and the promise of secrets long buried finally coming to light. As the festival faded into dusk, Michael Davis carried Mary Johnson to the edge of the square, cradling her small frame with unexpected gentleness. The child's breathing had steadied, but her eyes remained wide with lingering fear. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the cobblestones of Willow Creek's historic center. "You're safe now," Michael whispered, his silver hair catching the last golden rays of sunlight. He settled onto a bench beneath an ancient oak tree, keeping Mary secure in his protective embrace. Villagers gathered in small clusters nearby, their hushed conversations punctuated by furtive glances. Some appeared concerned, others judgmental, but none approached. The town doctor hovered uncertainly at the periphery, medical bag in hand, clearly torn between professional duty and social hesitation. "Should we call someone?" a woman finally asked, her voice barely carrying across the square. Michael shook his head. "She needs peace, not more commotion." His authoritative tone left no room for argument. The millionaire's unexpected return to Willow Creek after 2 decades had already stirred enough gossip. His intervention now would fuel speculation for months. Mary curled her fingers into the fabric of his expensive jacket, her tiny body still trembling. "Will she come back?" she whispered, not daring to look up. "Not tonight," he assured her, though uncertainty shadowed his eyes. He recognized the signs of a child accustomed to disappointment, to broken promises. Across town, Linda Johnson slammed the front door of her meticulously maintained colonial home. The practiced smile she'd maintained while leaving the festival evaporated, replaced by a twisted grimace of humiliation and rage. She kicked off her heels with such force that one cracked the hallway mirror. "How dare he?" she hissed, storming into the living room. Her fingers trembled as she poured herself a generous glass of wine. 20 years gone, and he thinks he can waltz back and judge me?" Linda paced across the hardwood floors, her shadows stretching and contracting against the walls decorated with carefully arranged family photographs. Each image showed Mary with a perfect smile that never reached her eyes, posed beside her stepmother like a prized possession. "They won't laugh at me again," she muttered, her voice growing harder with each repetition. "They won't laugh at me again." The wine sloshed dangerously close to the rim of her glass as she moved. She paused before a particular photo. Mary's mother smiling beside a younger Michael Davis. With deliberate slowness, Linda turned the frame face down. "This town has no idea who they're dealing with," she whispered to the empty room. The morning after the festival, Michael Davis shocked Willow Creek by purchasing the abandoned Maple Lane estate. The sprawling Victorian property had stood empty for years, its peeling paint and overgrown gardens a silent reminder of faded prosperity. Within 48 hours, local workers swarmed the grounds, their trucks lining the curved driveway as hammers and saws broke the estate's long silence. "He's spending a fortune to renovate that old place," whispered the townspeople as they gathered at the local diner. "Must be running from something in the city." The rumors spread faster than the actual renovation work, with theories ranging from tax evasion to a broken heart. Among the craftsmen hired was Robert Smith, a carpenter whose gentle hands belied his imposing height. Robert moved through the world quietly, his stutter making him reluctant to speak unless necessary. The other workers gave him space, respecting his skill while maintaining distance. When he did speak, his words emerged carefully measured, as if each one cost him something precious. One afternoon, while installing bookshelves in what would become Michael's study, Robert noticed a small figure watching from the doorway. Mary Johnson stood with her arms wrapped around herself, eyes wide with curiosity. "Would you like to see what I'm doing?" Robert asked, his voice soft enough not to startle her. The child nodded, taking hesitant steps into the room. He showed her how to sand wood until it felt like silk beneath her fingertips. Mary didn't speak, but her attention never wavered. The following week, Robert invited her to his workshop behind the main house. Unlike the chaos of the renovation, his personal space was meticulously organized, with tools hanging in perfect alignment and wood shavings swept into neat piles. On a shelf near the window sat dozens of tiny wooden animals, foxes with alert ears, bears with rounded paws, owls with intricate feather patterns. "You can hold them," he offered, noticing her fascination. Mary cradled a small rabbit in her palm, running her finger along its carved ears. For the first time since he'd met her, she smiled, a brief, fragile thing that transformed her face. They fell into a routine. Mary would appear after school, slipping away from her stepmother's watchful eye to sit quietly on a stool in Robert's workshop. He would carve, occasionally explaining a technique or telling her the name of a tool, but mostly they existed in comfortable silence. In that peaceful space, both found something they desperately needed: acceptance without demands, companionship without judgment. Neither spoke about the bruises that sometimes appeared on Mary's arms, or how Robert flinched when strangers approached too quickly. Some wounds didn't need words to be understood. Principal Susan Brown had been watching Mary Johnson for weeks. The child barely spoke during class, her small frame hunched as if trying to disappear. Today, Susan noticed Mary tugging at her long sleeves despite the warm classroom, a gesture that set off alarm bells in her experienced mind. When Mary's sleeve briefly rode up, revealing purplish marks on her thin wrist, Susan's suspicions hardened into certainty. After the final bell, Susan approached Mary's desk with a gentle smile. "Mary, I wanted to invite you to our after-school art club. We meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the East Wing." She kept her voice casual, noting how the girl's eyes widened with interest before darting away. "I don't think my stepmother would let me stay," Mary whispered, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on her desk. "I'll call her myself," Susan replied, already planning how she would frame it as an academic opportunity Linda Johnson couldn't refuse without raising eyebrows. 2 days later, Mary timidly entered the art room, where 6 other children were already scattered around tables covered in supplies. Susan had carefully selected this group, each child carrying their own burdens, each finding solace in creation rather than words. "Welcome," the principal said, guiding Mary to a table with colored chalks and large sheets of paper. "There are no rules here except one. Whatever you create belongs only to you." For the first 15 minutes, Mary simply watched, her hands folded in her lap. Then, hesitantly, she selected a piece of blue chalk and began to draw. By the end of the hour, her paper held a fantastical landscape, a forest where trees had faces and birds wore tiny crowns. "Would you like to tell us about your picture?" Susan asked softly. To everyone's surprise, Mary nodded. Her voice, barely audible at first, grew stronger as she described a magical forest where children could speak to trees and where no adults were allowed unless invited. The story continued, growing more elaborate with each sentence, until even Jason Miller, the most restless 4th grader in school, sat transfixed. Week after week, Mary returned, her stories becoming more complex. She spoke of brave children outsmarting wicked queens, of magical helpers who appeared when needed most, and of secret passages that led to safety. Susan recognized the coded truths woven through these tales. As an educator with 20 years' experience, she had seen children speak their pain through metaphor when direct words failed them. Each story Mary told revealed another piece of her reality, another glimpse into her home life. "She's extraordinary," whispered Ms. Patel, the art teacher, after one particularly moving session. Susan nodded, watching Mary carefully pack away her chalks. "And she's telling us everything if we just know how to listen." Rain drummed against the windows of Maple Lane Estate as Michael Davis wandered through his newly acquired home. The renovation crew had left for the day, leaving him alone with the creaking floorboards and whispers of history embedded in the walls. Curiosity drew him toward the attic, a space he hadn't properly explored since purchasing the property. The wooden stairs groaned under his weight as he ascended, flashlight in hand. The attic air hung heavy with dust and memories. The distinct scent of old cedar chests mingled with faint traces of lavender sachets long forgotten. Michael moved carefully between stacked furniture, draped in yellowed sheets, his silver hair catching the dim light that filtered through a small round window. Behind a massive oak trunk, partially hidden by a faded quilt, he noticed a small leather-bound box. The millionaire knelt, wincing slightly as his knees protested, and lifted the lid. Inside lay several journals, their covers worn soft with handling, tied together with a simple blue ribbon. "Elizabeth Johnson," he whispered, tracing the name inscribed on the topmost diary. "Mary's mother." His hands trembled as he untied the ribbon, memories flooding back of the woman he'd once planned to marry, before circumstances tore them apart. The art dealer settled onto an old rocking chair and opened the first journal. Elizabeth's elegant handwriting filled the pages, stories of her hopes, her fears, and later, entries about her daughter. As Michael turned page after page, his throat tightened. She had written about him too, about promises they'd made under summer stars when they were young and believed in forever. "I still believe he'll return someday," one entry read, "and when he does, perhaps he'll understand why I made the choices I did." Rain pounded harder against the roof as he continued reading, discovering references to Linda that made his blood run cold. Before becoming Mary's stepmother, she had worked as a maid in this very house during the time Michael and Elizabeth were engaged. The journals revealed Linda's jealousy, her subtle manipulations, and the rumors she had spread that eventually contributed to Michael and Elizabeth's separation. "I fear what might happen if I'm no longer here to protect Mary," Elizabeth had written in one of the final entries. "Linda watches her with such coldness sometimes." Michael closed the journal, his hands no longer steady. The weight of a promise made decades ago pressed down on him, a vow to always protect Elizabeth, no matter what. He hadn't been there when she needed him most, but her daughter still needed protection. "I won't fail you again," he whispered to the empty attic, tucking the journals carefully into his jacket. The secrets buried in those pages would change everything in Willow Creek. Linda Johnson paced the kitchen floor, her manicured nails tapping against the enrollment forms from Willow Creek Elementary. The morning light caught the glint in her eyes as she deliberately checked the wrong boxes on Mary's health assessment. With calculated precision, she exaggerated every minor cold the child had ever experienced, fabricating a history of respiratory issues that didn't exist. "Perfect," she whispered, sealing the envelope with a sharp lick. The school would surely limit Mary's activities now. No more art club, no more chances for the girl to speak to outsiders. When the phone rang 3 days later, Linda recognized Principal Susan Brown's number immediately. She composed herself, voice honeyed with false concern as she answered. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm calling about Mary's enrollment forms," Susan began, her professional tone masking her suspicion. There seemed to be some discrepancies with her previous health records. Linda's rehearsed response flowed effortlessly. "Mary's health is delicate. She can't keep up with the other children," she sighed dramatically. "The poor thing inherits her mother's weak constitution." Susan paused, the silence stretching uncomfortably. "That's interesting. Her previous teacher noted she was quite energetic during physical education." "Appearances can be deceiving," Linda countered smoothly. "I'm simply looking out for my stepdaughter's well-being." After hanging up, the stepmother smiled thinly, satisfied her barrier between Mary and the outside world remained intact. She didn't notice Susan's skeptical tone, too wrapped up in her own performance. Upstairs, 6-year-old Mary sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, a small sanctuary despite its sparse furnishings. The child clutched her mother's faded blue scarf to her chest, inhaling the faint lavender scent that somehow lingered years after her passing. The soft fabric was worn thin from constant handling, but Mary treasured it above all possessions. With trembling fingers, she smoothed out scraps of paper salvaged from Linda's recycling bin. Using stubby pencils hidden beneath her mattress, Mary sketched elaborate stories, tiny figures with wings escaping tall towers, birds soaring over endless oceans. Each drawing told the same story: freedom. When footsteps approached her door, Mary quickly tucked the papers and scarf beneath her bed. Linda appeared in the doorway, scrutinizing the room for imperfections. "Your uniform needs ironing for tomorrow," she announced, eyes narrowing at Mary's hunched posture. "And sit up straight. No one respects a girl who slouches." After Linda left, Mary retrieved her treasures, returning to her secret world of stories. In these fragile paper moments, she wasn't the frightened girl from the town square. In her sketches, she could breathe freely, far from her stepmother's perfectionist pressure and cold laughter. The drawings were her voice when words failed her only escape in a house where walls had ears, and freedom seemed as distant as the stars. Robert Smith hunched over his workbench long after the other carpenters had gone home. Sawdust clung to his flannel shirt as his calloused hands smoothed the edges of polished oak panels. The workshop's single bulb cast long shadows across the floor, but he didn't mind the solitude. For weeks, he had been collecting scraps of red velvet from the town's upholstery shop, carefully setting them aside for this special project. "She needs a voice," he whispered to himself, fingers tracing the miniature proscenium arch he'd carved with woodland creatures, tiny squirrels and birds that seemed almost alive in the wood grain. The puppet stage was small enough for a child to manage, but crafted with the same care he'd give a piece of fine furniture. As dawn broke over Willow Creek, Robert wrapped the finished puppet theater in brown paper. His stutter disappeared when he wrote the simple note, "For your stories, so everyone can hear them." He placed the package on Mary Johnson's porch before the household stirred, then retreated to watch from behind the maple tree across the street. The little girl discovered the gift while Linda was still sleeping. Mary's tiny fingers unwrapped the paper with reverent care, her eyes widening at the sight of the polished wood and velvet curtains. For a moment, she stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth as if to contain her joy. That afternoon, while her stepmother attended a committee meeting, Mary set up her first puppet show in the backyard. She fashioned crude puppets from old socks and buttons, giving each character a voice she never dared use herself. The carpenter watched from a distance, his heart swelling as her trembling hands grew steady with each scene. Within days, neighborhood children gathered to watch Mary's performances. Her stories never directly mentioned the corset or Linda's cruelty, but everyone recognized the wicked queen who forced the princess to wear magical binding clothes that stole her breath. The tales of escape and freedom resonated with the young audience, who sat cross-legged on the grass, entranced. Michael Davis attended one afternoon, standing at the back of the small crowd. He noticed how Mary's eyes lit up when performing, a transformation from the frightened child at the fountain to a confident storyteller. Her coded narratives revealed truths about her life that were sharper than any direct accusation could be. Susan Brown brought art supplies from school, helping Mary create more elaborate puppets. With each new character and story, the girl found pieces of herself she'd hidden away. The puppet stage became more than a toy. It was her sanctuary, her courtroom, and her voice, all crafted by hands that understood what it meant to be silenced. The Willow Creek Town Hall buzzed with tension as residents filed in for the monthly council meeting. Oak panels and outdated portraits of former mayors created an atmosphere of stifling tradition, the kind that had kept the town's secrets buried for generations. Michael Davis arrived precisely 5 minutes early, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the casual attire of most attendees. Linda Johnson sat near the front, her posture rigid as she nodded at acquaintances. The whispers that followed her entrance weren't as respectful as they once had been. 3 weeks had passed since the Founders' Day incident, and the town's collective memory was proving inconveniently long. When the floor opened for community concerns, Michael rose with deliberate calm. The room fell silent. "I've returned to Willow Creek after 20 years," he began, his voice carrying to every corner without effort. "And I find some things never change, particularly how this town values appearances over truth." Several council members shifted uncomfortably. Mayor Wilson cleared his throat, but Michael continued. "Mary Johnson is 6 years old. She attends your schools, walks your streets, and suffers abuse in plain sight while you all pretend not to notice." His silver hair caught the light as he turned to face Linda directly. "Her stepmother uses public humiliation as discipline and restricts her breathing with outdated garments no child should wear." Linda shot to her feet. "How dare you? You know nothing about raising children. Mary needs structure." "Structure?" Michael's question hung in the air. "Is that what you call forcing a child to wear a corset until she collapses?" The stepmother's face flushed crimson. "She's dramatic. Always has been. Ask anyone." Susan Brown stood then, her presence as school principal lending weight to the moment. "I've documented concerning patterns in Mary's behavior and physical condition that align with Mr. Davis's observations." Linda's voice quavered as she attempted to defend herself. "This is ridiculous. I've been nothing but devoted to that child since her mother died." The carpenter, Robert Smith, rarely spoke at these meetings, but he rose now, his stutter more pronounced under pressure. I've seen the bruises too." Council members exchanged uneasy glances. Councilwoman Patel leaned forward, addressing Linda directly. "Perhaps we should discuss this further with Child Protective Services present." "You can't possibly believe," Linda began, but the damage was done. For the first time in Willow Creek's long history of polite avoidance, the foundation of silence began to crack. People who had turned away from uncomfortable truths for years were finally forced to look. The protective facade that had sheltered Linda's behavior was crumbling, brick by carefully maintained brick. As the meeting adjourned, Michael caught Linda's eye across the room. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. The town's conspiracy of silence would no longer shield her. Winter descended upon Willow Creek, blanketing the village in a pristine stillness that muffled even the harshest whispers. The annual charity gala, held in the town's historic council hall, shimmered with promise as volunteers transformed the space with velvet curtains and strings of crystal lights that cast dancing shadows across the polished floors. A hush of anticipation filled the room as residents in their finest attire mingled, their breath visible in the cold air despite the building's struggling heating system. Mary Johnson stood backstage, her small frame nearly disappearing in the shadows. Principal Susan Brown knelt beside her, straightening the simple blue dress she had insisted the child wear, instead of the elaborate, restrictive outfit Linda had initially selected. "Remember," Susan whispered, her eyes kind but serious, "your story is your own. No one can take that from you." The 6-year-old nodded, clutching a hand-carved wooden bird puppet that Robert Smith had made especially for this performance. The carpenter had spent weeks perfecting the delicate wing joints that allowed the bird to appear as if it were truly attempting flight. His gift had arrived on her doorstep the previous morning, accompanied by a note with just 2 words, "Fly high." When the MC announced her name, Mary stepped onto the stage with trembling legs. The spotlight felt both blinding and oddly comforting. In its glare, she could barely make out the audience's faces. Her gaze briefly caught Michael Davis in the front row, his silver hair gleaming, his expression one of quiet encouragement. Linda sat 3 rows back, her smile fixed and cold, fingers tapping impatiently against her purse. Mary's voice started as barely a whisper as she began her tale of a small bird trapped in a gilded cage, desperate for freedom, yet terrified of the unknown world beyond its bars. As the story progressed, her voice grew stronger. The puppet in her hands seemed to come alive, its wooden wings fluttering with increasing determination against invisible constraints. The bird had forgotten how to fly, Mary said, her eyes now fixed on some distant point above the audience. But it remembered how to sing. By the time the wooden bird in her hands finally broke free from its imaginary cage, soaring above the heads of the audience in a sweeping arc guided by Mary's nimble fingers, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Even the most stoic town elders dabbed discreetly at their cheeks. In that moment of silence before the applause erupted, Susan caught Michael's gaze across the room. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that Mary's story had cracked open something long sealed in Willow Creek's collective conscience. As the last echoes of applause faded from Mary's performance, Michael Davis lingered near the refreshment table, his silver hair catching the glow of the crystal chandeliers. Eleanor Wright, the town's elderly historian, approached him with cautious steps, clutching a weathered leather portfolio to her chest. "There's something you should see," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the gala crowd. Michael's expression remained composed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. He followed Eleanor to a quiet alcove, where she carefully extracted a bundle of yellowed letters tied with faded blue ribbon. "I've been archiving the town's correspondence for the Historical Society," the historian explained, her fingers trembling slightly. "These were donated anonymously last month. I recognized the names immediately." The art dealer's hands hesitated before accepting the bundle. As he unfolded the first letter, his breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakable, flowing curves and deliberate strokes he'd once memorized like poetry. "Catherine," he whispered, the name of Mary's mother passing his lips like a prayer. Eleanor nodded solemnly. "You were engaged to her 20 years ago." Michael's eyes scanned the passionate declarations, promises of forever, plans for a future that never materialized. His fingers traced the signature at the bottom of each page, memories flooding back with painful clarity. "There's more," Eleanor said, extracting another set of letters. "These are from the estate records." The second bundle revealed an unexpected connection, employment records and correspondence showing that Linda Johnson had worked as a maid at Michael's family estate during the same period. Her application, written in the same tight, controlled script she used today, listed references and qualifications, but between the lines lay something darker. "She was there when Catherine broke off your engagement," Eleanor observed quietly. Michael's jaw tightened as he read a particularly revealing letter. Linda's request for a character reference after leaving her position abruptly. Between the formal lines lay hints of resentment, jealousy, and ambition. "She's been nursing these resentments for 2 decades, he realized, the pieces finally clicking into place. And when she married Catherine's widower, she found herself stepmother to the daughter of the woman she envied," Eleanor finished. "The daughter who might have been yours in another life." Michael carefully refolded the letters, his hands steady despite the storm of emotions behind his eyes. Across the room, he could see Mary sitting with Susan Brown, the child's face animated as she described something to the attentive principal. "Thank you," he said to Eleanor, his voice low but resolute. "These change everything." The historian nodded, understanding the weight of secrets finally brought to light. "Some wounds never heal," she murmured. "They just fester in the dark." News of Linda Johnson's fraudulent actions spread through Willow Creek with the speed of a winter blaze. At the Maple Lane coffee shop, hushed conversations halted whenever the door chimed. The town librarian clutched a manila folder to her chest, eyes darting nervously as she slipped it to Principal Susan Brown behind a shelf of historical fiction. "These are copies of Mary's original enrollment forms," she whispered. "The signatures don't match the ones filed last month." Susan's face hardened as she examined the documents. The differences were unmistakable. Linda had forged Mary's late mother's signature on medical exemption forms, attendance waivers, and psychological evaluations. Each paper represented another attempt to isolate the 6-year-old from potential allies. That evening, Susan drove to Michael Davis's estate, the folder secured in her leather bag. The millionaire welcomed her into his study, silver hair catching the lamplight as he pored over the evidence. "I found something too," Michael said, sliding a stack of bank statements across his mahogany desk. "Linda's been diverting Mary's inheritance, small amounts but consistently for 3 years. They worked late into the night, connecting threads of deception that stretched back to before Mary's mother died. The principal organized their findings methodically, her hands steady despite her anger. We'll need to present this to Child Protective Services," Susan said, "and possibly the district attorney." Michael nodded, his voice low but determined. "Whatever it takes. That child deserves better." Meanwhile, Linda paced her kitchen floor, phone pressed to her ear as she called her 4th friend that evening. Each conversation ended more abruptly than the last. Her social circle, once eager to overlook her sharp edges in exchange for invitations to exclusive gatherings, now sent her calls to voicemail. "They're turning everyone against me," she hissed to her reflection in the microwave door. "That pompous art dealer thinks he can waltz back into town and destroy what I've built." When the president of the Ladies' Auxiliary suggested Linda take a break from organizing the spring fundraiser, her carefully constructed facade finally cracked. She slammed her teacup down, sending china shards across the cafe table. "You're all hypocrites," she snarled. "I've done everything for this town while raising a difficult child alone." The outburst only accelerated her isolation. By week's end, Linda found herself seated alone at church, a conspicuous empty pew surrounding her where supporters once sat. She clutched her purse with white knuckles, her smile fixed and brittle, as whispers continued behind cupped hands. The tide had turned in Willow Creek, and Linda Johnson was drowning in the consequences of her own making. Robert Smith's peaceful routine shattered when whispers of his past began circulating through Willow Creek. The accusations weren't new, vague allegations from years ago about inappropriate behavior around children. But they gained fresh momentum as his friendship with Mary Johnson grew more visible. "I heard he was run out of Millfield before coming here," Martha Wilson muttered to her friend outside the grocery store. "Should we really let someone like that near our children?" The carpenter retreated to his workshop, the familiar scent of sawdust offering little comfort as he worked on a new set of puppets. His hands trembled slightly, making the delicate carving more difficult. He'd fought these battles before, always innocent, but forever marked. What Robert didn't expect was the children's response. One afternoon, as he closed his workshop early to avoid confrontation, he found 7 of Mary's classmates waiting outside, clutching drawings they'd made of his puppet creations. "Mr. Smith, we want you to teach us how to make puppets too," said Tommy, the boldest of the group. "Mary says you're the best." Their parents hovered nervously in the background, some supportive, others uncertain, but unwilling to disappoint their determined children. That evening, Susan Brown called an impromptu meeting at the school. "I've known Robert for 5 years," the principal stated firmly. "I've vetted his background thoroughly. These rumors are just that, rumors. And I won't have a good man's reputation destroyed by gossip." Michael Davis sat quietly in the back, observing. He'd done his own investigation and found nothing concerning in the carpenter's past, only a shy man who'd been easy to misunderstand. It was Mary who made the boldest move. The following weekend, during the small farmers market performance she'd been planning, the 6-year-old girl approached Robert with determination in her eyes. "Will you help me tell the story?" she asked. offering him the puppet she'd made herself, a tall figure with kind eyes. Robert hesitated, aware of the watching crowd. "Are you so sure?" he stuttered. Mary nodded and took his hand. Together they performed a wordless tale of friendship and trust. Robert's skilled hands brought the wooden characters to life, while Mary narrated through movement rather than words. The audience watched, transfixed, as the story unfolded. By the final bow, something had shifted in Willow Creek. Not everyone was convinced, but enough people recognized the genuine bond between the gentle carpenter and the brave little girl to quiet the worst of the rumors. "Some wounds heal slowly," Susan remarked to Michael afterward, "but they do heal." Susan Brown sat across from Mary Johnson at the small desk in her office, watching as the child's delicate fingers traced patterns on a blank sheet of paper. The principal's eyes softened with a familiar ache, the same hollow feeling that visited her each time she saw a child in need. Her own daughter would have been about Mary's age now, had fate been kinder. "Stories can be like secret messages," Susan explained, her voice gentle as she placed a worn book of poetry between them. "Sometimes, when we can't say something directly, we can use other things to show how we feel." Mary looked up, her eyes curious but cautious. "Like my puppets?" "Exactly like your puppets," Susan nodded. "That bird you carved with Robert, it wasn't just a bird, was it?" The little girl shook her head, a hint of a smile forming. The principal recognized that spark, the first flicker of understanding that her thoughts had value, that her voice mattered. 3 times a week, they met after school hours. Susan taught Mary about metaphors, how a storm could represent anger, how a locked door might symbolize secrets. The child absorbed everything eagerly, her natural creativity blossoming under careful guidance. "My mother used to tell me stories," Mary whispered one afternoon, clutching her mother's old scarf, "about animals who could speak truths that people couldn't." Susan's heart tightened. "Those sound like wonderful stories. Would you like to write one down?" In the weeks that followed, Mary's tales evolved. What began as simple puppet shows transformed into layered narratives. The educator watched with quiet pride as her student crafted characters that bore striking resemblances to villagers. The fox who hoarded secrets, the peacock obsessed with appearances, the caged nightingale whose song made others uncomfortable. The townspeople didn't immediately recognize themselves in these performances, but Susan saw how Mary's stories made them shift uncomfortably, how certain metaphors landed like pebbles in still water, creating ripples of recognition. "You're giving words to things that need to be said," Susan told her one evening as they packed away notebooks. "That takes courage." Mary looked up, her small face serious. "Is that why some people look angry when I tell my stories?" The principal knelt down, meeting the child's gaze. "Sometimes people don't want to see the truth, even when it's wrapped in beautiful words. But that doesn't mean you should stop." With each new story, Mary's voice grew stronger, her metaphors sharper. The trembling child, who once collapsed in the town square, was finding her power, one word at a time. And Susan, watching from the sidelines, felt her own grief ease slightly. Unable to save her daughter, she was at least helping save someone else's. Spring blossomed across Willow Creek, bringing with it a renewal that extended beyond the flowering dogwoods lining Main Street. The town council had scheduled a public vote that threatened to remove Linda Johnson from her position as head of the Community Improvement Committee, a post she'd jealously guarded for years. The meeting hall buzzed with whispers as residents filed in. Susan Brown sat near the front, a folder of documented incidents clutched in her hands. Robert Smith slipped in quietly, choosing a seat near the back, his fingers nervously tapping against his knee. The carpenter had found his voice in recent weeks, speaking up about what he'd witnessed at the Johnson household. When Linda entered, her smile appeared brittle, her eyes darting from face to face. She wore her finest dress, as if appearance alone could shield her from the truth. The stepmother's confidence visibly faltered when Michael Davis walked in with Mary at his side. "This meeting is a farce," Linda announced, her voice carrying across the room. "I've dedicated years to this community while outsiders spread malicious rumors." The vote was nearly unanimous. As the council president announced the results, Linda's composure cracked entirely. She spun toward Mary, who stood small but straight-backed near the water fountain. "You ungrateful little liar," she hissed, lunging forward. "After everything I've done for you since your mother died. Who do you think kept a roof over your head? Who clothed you?" The 6-year-old trembled visibly, but didn't step back. Her tiny hands formed fists at her sides as tears gathered in her eyes. "You hurt me," Mary whispered, her voice gaining strength with each word. "You made me wear things that hurt. You laughed when I couldn't breathe." The crowd fell silent, the raw truth hanging in the air. Linda's face contorted, her mask of respectability finally slipping completely. "Nobody will believe the fantasies of a disturbed child," she spat, looking desperately around the room for allies. But the faces that met hers were cold and unforgiving. Michael stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Mary's shoulder. The millionaire's voice cut through the tension, clear and unwavering. "She is not invisible anymore," he declared, his silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. "None of the children in this town should be. We've all been complicit in our silence." Mary looked up at him, then across the room to where Susan and Robert watched. For the first time in the town hall, she stood tall, a small figure who had found her strength in the most unlikely of places, her own voice. The fallout came swiftly. Michael Davis lost 3 major art acquisition contracts within a week of his public confrontation with Linda. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from former colleagues questioning his provincial crusade. As one particularly scathing email put it, the art world, it seemed, preferred its millionaires to remain detached from small-town politics. "Their loss," Michael muttered one morning, setting down his smartphone on the kitchen counter of the Maple Lane estate. Through the bay windows, dawn painted the garden in hues of amber and gold. Across from him, Mary Johnson cupped her hands around a steaming mug of chamomile tea, her small fingers tracing the ceramic rim. "Are you in trouble because of me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The silver-haired man smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Some things matter more than business, Mary. Always remember that." These morning rituals became sacred to them both. Michael would prepare breakfast, nothing elaborate, just toast with jam and fruit, while Mary would sketch ideas for her next puppet show in a leather-bound notebook Susan had given her. Sometimes they spoke, sharing stories or plans for the day. Other times they simply existed together in comfortable silence, healing in the quiet understanding between them. For the first time in her young life, Mary had space to breathe. Without Linda's suffocating presence, the child blossomed. Her puppet shows, once performed in trembling whispers, now filled the community center every Saturday afternoon. Robert built her an expanded stage with interchangeable backdrops, his gentle hands crafting miniature forests and village scenes with remarkable detail. "Watch how the light catches here," the carpenter would explain, demonstrating how to manipulate the puppets for maximum effect. His stutter faded when he focused on his craft, replaced by quiet confidence that Mary began to mirror. What started as one child's expression soon sparked something larger. Children from across Willow Creek began creating their own puppets from paper bags and old socks, acting out stories in backyards and school playgrounds. Parents watched, sometimes uncomfortable, as innocent tales revealed truths about family dynamics and unspoken rules. "They're finding their voices," Susan Brown observed during one of Mary's performances. The principal stood beside Michael, watching as 20 children sat cross-legged on the floor, mesmerized by Mary's tale of a bird learning to sing after years of silence. "It's more than that," Michael replied softly. They're changing this town, one story at a time. Each puppet show, each shared story became a small rebellion against generations of silence. And Mary Johnson, once invisible, now stood at the center of it all. Linda Johnson stood alone in the kitchen of her once bustling home, the silence pressing against her like a physical weight. The town council had voted unanimously to remove her from the Chamber of Commerce board, a position she'd wielded like a scepter for nearly 8 years. Her carefully curated social calendar now lay empty, phone calls unreturned, invitations rescinded. The woman traced her finger along the granite countertop, remembering how neighbors once gathered here for her famous holiday parties. Now the house echoed with absence. She wandered from room to room in her slippers, the hardwood floors creaking beneath her feet. "They won't laugh at me again," Linda whispered to her reflection in the hallway mirror. But the words fell flat in the empty space. The practiced smile she'd perfected over years of social climbing now looked strained, almost grotesque in the dim light. Across town, Mary Johnson was slowly blossoming under newfound freedom. The 6-year-old no longer flinched at sudden movements or hid her drawings. Yet freedom came with its own challenges. Some nights she still woke gasping, certain she could feel the corset tightening around her small chest. Susan Brown recognized the signs of trauma from her years working with children. The principal created a safe space in her office where Mary could retreat when memories overwhelmed her. "Healing isn't linear," she explained gently one afternoon, offering the child a cup of hot chocolate. "Some days will feel harder than others." Robert Smith proved equally instrumental in Mary's recovery. The carpenter spent weekends teaching her how to sand wood until it felt like silk beneath her fingertips. His workshop became a sanctuary where mistakes were celebrated as learning opportunities rather than failures. I used to be afraid too," he told her one day, his stutter more pronounced when sharing personal truths. "But creating something with your hands, it helps remind you that you can build beautiful things, even after ugly experiences." Michael Davis watched this transformation from a respectful distance, providing resources but careful not to overwhelm Mary with attention. The millionaire understood that trust, once broken, required patience to rebuild. During a particularly difficult afternoon when Mary refused to join the school art show, fearing public ridicule, Susan and Robert sat with her for hours, neither pushing nor retreating. Their steady presence eventually calmed her racing heart. "Your stories belong to you," Susan reminded her. "You share them when you're ready, not when others demand it." Slowly, with this gentle encouragement, Mary began to trust again, first in small ways, then in larger ones. Her voice, once whisper-soft, grew steadier with each passing day, carrying stories that were finally, truly her own. The town buzzed with anticipation as Founders' Day approached once more. Almost a year had passed since that fateful afternoon when Mary Johnson had collapsed by the limestone fountain. Now, the 6-year-old girl spent every evening in Robert's workshop, perfecting a performance that would change everything. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Robert asked, his gentle stutter more pronounced with concern. He carefully adjusted the final puppet, a small bird with wings that could actually spread open. Mary nodded, her small fingers tracing the polished wood. "I need to," she whispered. The workshop smelled of cedar and possibility. When the day arrived, Willow Creek Square transformed into a kaleidoscope of celebration. Vendors lined the cobblestones, flags fluttered overhead, and the same limestone fountain gurgled in the center, a silent witness to what had happened before. Susan Brown stood near the makeshift stage, clipboard in hand, but eyes constantly scanning for Mary. The principal had helped arrange this special performance, convincing the committee despite Linda's remaining supporters. "She's ready," Michael Davis said, appearing beside Susan. The art dealer's silver hair caught the afternoon light as he nodded toward the side street where Mary waited. The crowd hushed as the small girl stepped into the square. Gone was the frightened child from last year. Mary walked barefoot, her steps deliberate, wearing a simple blue dress with her mother's scarf draped around her shoulders. In her arms, she carried the puppet stage Robert had crafted for her. She set up directly beside the fountain, the exact spot where she had once fallen gasping for air. Once, she began, her voice clear and steady, there was a village that kept its secrets in jars. Her hands brought the puppets to life. A small bird trapped in glass, a looming shadow figure, a silver key. The townspeople shifted uncomfortably as Mary's story unfolded. Through metaphor and carefully chosen words, she revealed the pattern of abuse she had endured, the village's willful blindness, and the courage it took to break generations of silence. Robert watched from the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down his face. Nearby, Linda stood alone, her face a mask of stone, as her public facade crumbled with each word her stepdaughter spoke. When Mary reached the climax of her tale, she released the bird puppet from its cage, its wooden wings spreading wide. And the village learned that day, she said, her eyes sweeping across the silent crowd, that a story told is a chain broken. The last word hung in the air for one breathless moment. Then, as if released from a spell, the entire square rose to their feet, not in mockery or laughter, but in stunned, reverent awe. Tears glimmered on Michael Davis's cheeks as he stepped forward through the hushed crowd. The silver-haired millionaire placed a gentle hand on Mary's shoulder. His voice soft but resolute as it carried across the town square. "She is not invisible anymore," he declared, the simple words hanging in the air, like a promise finally fulfilled. The villagers of Willow Creek exchanged glances, some ashamed, others moved to tears themselves. Principal Brown stood at the edge of the gathering, her hands clasped tightly together, pride evident in her stance. The educator who had lost her own daughter years ago now watched Mary stand tall, vindicated. Robert shifted nervously beside his handcrafted puppet stage, the polished oak gleaming in the afternoon sun. The carpenter's usual stutter disappeared as he called out, "That was beautiful, Mary!" His voice, though quiet, carried conviction that made several townspeople nod in agreement. Linda was nowhere to be seen. The former community leader had retreated to the shadows of her diminished existence. Her social ambitions crumbled beneath the weight of exposed truths. The corset she had once wielded as a tool of control lay abandoned, a relic of cruelty that would never touch Mary again. Mary Johnson, no longer the frightened 6-year-old who had collapsed by the limestone fountain, stood barefoot on the same cobblestones where her journey began. She clutched her mother's faded scarf, the fabric a bridge between past and future. The small girl's eyes, once downcast and fearful, now met the gazes of those around her with quiet confidence. "I think," said Susan, approaching with measured steps, "this calls for ice cream at Wilson's." The principal winked at Mary. Offering normalcy after extraordinary courage, the crowd began to disperse, but something had fundamentally shifted in Willow Creek. Neighbors spoke in hushed, reflective tones. Parents held their children closer. The weight of collective silence had lifted, leaving room for healing to begin. Michael knelt before Mary, his eyes level with hers. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered, the mention of her bringing fresh tears to his eyes. "I promised her I'd come back someday. I just wish it hadn't taken so long." Mary smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Will you stay now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Wild horses couldn't drag me away," the art dealer replied, his hand gently squeezing hers. And all of Willow Creek understood. Everything began the day a little girl cried, "I can't breathe," and a stranger chose to shout. But it ended with something far more powerful. A community finally learning to listen.